Hey everybody, Beth Hall from Coach Hall Writes here. And in today's video, we're going to talk about how to make a qualifying score on the 2024 AP Lang exam. Be sure to stay in touch by subscribing and turning your notifications on. Also, check out the description box for useful links as you prepare for the AP Lang exam. Let's start by talking about the exam format. So the first section of the AP Lang exam is the multiple choice section. You're going to answer 45 questions in 1 hour. The first two passages are going to be reading passages. So these are more of the reading comprehension skills. These passages tend to be longer and perhaps a little bit more dense. It could be an older passage or it could be something contemporary. It will be nonfiction. So for these passages, you should expect between 10 and 13 comprehension questions about the passage. There are also going to be 3 writing passages. The writing multiple choice passages are going to say something to the effect of, "This is a draft" at the top. These passages were written for the exam and they have errors in them. That's because there are going to be editing questions. So you're going to have a shorter passage. These tend to be much quicker because there are only 5 to 8 questions or so per passage. And so you're going to be asked about transitions and adding or deleting sentences, things like that. After the multiple choice section, there will be a 10-minute break, and then you'll return for the FRQs, which are the essays. You will have 2 hours and 15 minutes to write 3 essays. This will include a little bit of reading time. The College Board recommends a 15-minute reading period and 40 minutes for each of the 3 essays. That's why it totals 2 hours and 15 minutes. The essays are going to be in the order of synthesis, rhetorical analysis, and argument. However, you can answer the essays in any order that you choose. How much is each section worth? This will help us determine our composite. So we want to realize that the MCQ section is worth 45% of your composite score. So essentially, each question is worth 1 point. This is important to realize as a student because the hardest question of the 45 is worth 1 point, and the easiest question of the 45 is worth 1 point. So we don't want to spend too long on any one particular question. We also want to recognize that there's no penalty for guessing, so you should answer each question even if it's a guess. Let's say that there are 2 minutes left of your hour and you still have 5 questions to answer. Pick a letter and bubble it in if you're taking the paper test. So literally like a straight line bubble. Pick A or D, whichever letter you want to go with, it doesn't matter, and bubble in that letter all the way down. Don't make a pattern, just pick one letter and go for it. If you're taking the digital test, you wouldn't be bubbling, you'd be clicking, but the same principle applies. So we want to make sure that we answer all of the 45 questions, even if we're just guessing. Your essays are going to be scored on a 6-point rubric. You will have different readers for each of your essays because readers are trained for 1 essay. So if you write 3 essays, at least 3 individual people are going to be looking at those essays. You'll have 1 person looking at your synthesis essay, 1 person looking at your rhetorical analysis essay, and 1 person looking at your argument essay. Now, I said at least because there are table leaders who backread some of the essays, and so it is possible that you might have a couple sets of eyes on your essays. No big deal. The essays are worth 55% of your composite score, so they're worth a little bit more than the multiple choice. Now, I've been mentioning a composite score. We want to make sure that we understand what that is because sometimes students get confused between the 6-point rubric and the composite score. So when you receive your AP scores in July, it's usually around the 5th to the 8th or so that students get their scores. You're going to get a composite score, and this will be a number between 1 and 5. If you choose to send your scores to a college, the college will receive the composite score. You will not know how you did on each section of the exam, which I know is a little bit frustrating for students. Students want to know how many multiple choice questions they answered correctly. They want to know their individual essay scores. Teachers want to know that information too, but you just get the composite. So let's say you make a 4, that's the number that you're going to see when you check your scores. And if you send your scores to colleges, they will also see that 4 as well. So what score do you actually need? This is going to depend on a few different factors. First of all, a composite score of a 3 is considered a qualifying score. So I kind of did a little bit of a clickbait title for this video because I said how to pass the AP Lang exam, because that's how students phrase it. But technically, it's not about passing or failing, it's about earning a qualifying score. It's important to recognize that each college or university determines which scores they will accept for credit. So, for example, a community college will likely accept a 3, whereas more competitive schools might look for a 4 or a 5. You can find the requirements on the school's website. So, since I live in the state of Arkansas, usually what I do if a student wants to know what score they need for a particular college is I'll type in the name of that college and then I'll put AP Lang score or AP scores, and it will usually direct me in the search results to a page on the school's website where I can see all of the AP scores that they accept and what it will actually count toward as far as college credit. So this can be really helpful as you're going into your senior year and planning out which colleges you intend to apply to. Students are given the opportunity to send a free score report, but you have this window of time to do so. And I believe that window of time will close before you actually receive your scores. So if you are pretty confident in your scores, I always tell my students at least send your free score report to one of your schools. That being said, if you're applying to a really competitive school and you need a 4 or a 5 and you don't want to send that score report until you know your scores, that's okay. You can send a score report later. Now let's talk about how composites are determined. It's important to recognize that the numbers do fluctuate a little bit each year. So I'm going to walk you through the formula that I use with my students. Now, before I get into the math behind this, please know that there are some score calculators online that seem pretty accurate. But if you're looking to figure it out on your own, here is the math that you can use. So you get 1 point for each multiple choice question that you've answered correctly. So in our hypothetical example, our student has answered 30 questions correctly, so they're going to get 30 points. Now for the essays, this hypothetical student earned a 4 out of 6 on each essay. That's the score that I tell my students I want them to try to earn, a 4 out of 6 or higher. So if the student earns a 4 out of 6 on 3 essays, that's going to be 12 points, and we're going to multiply it by 3.0566. We're going to add our multiple choice number, which was 30, to our FRQ number. And then after we've done that, we're going to round. So it would be 67 points. Based on the breakdown that I use with my students, it would be on the lower end of a 4. Now, please remember that the cut scores I have on the screen might be slightly higher or slightly lower than the actual exam scores because those do fluctuate a little bit each year. I use this as a guideline to help my students know approximately where they are. Now we can get into the test taking tips that I have for you. So I already said this, but for multiple choice, please answer each question, even if it's a guess. Tip number 2 is play to your strengths. And this can mean a few different things. First of all, if you know that you are better at the writing MCQ than the reading MCQ, you might want to start with the writing MCQ and give yourself time, especially if you're much more accurate with that type of question, or if you feel like you're running out of time because of pacing. Some students like to start with the reading questions and make sure that they answer everything in order. And I totally understand that approach because that's probably what I would have done as a high school student. However, as a teacher, I have had some students who tend to be really strong with the writing MCQ and maybe a little bit slower with the reading MCQ. I've had them start with the writing MCQ and we saw an improvement in their scores and they liked that approach. So it's definitely something to practice with. Playing to your strengths also means that if you know you're really good at, let's say, words in context, like those vocab questions, if you're running out of time, prioritize those questions because you're good at them. Now, whether you're taking the paper test or the digital test, you can go back and forth in the multiple choice section. So if you're taking the digital test, for example, you can flag a question and come back to it later if you want to. So if a particular question seems really hard, or if a passage seems really hard, don't panic, just guess or mark it and come back to it later. and move on. Now, with the multiple choice, especially the reading multiple choice, you're going to want to use the process of elimination. I know this sounds like a really basic test taking tip, but it genuinely does help because on the AP Lang test, there are going to be 5 answer choices, not 4 like most standardized tests. So because of that, usually students can eliminate at least 2 answer choices right away. This can be helpful because sometimes if we don't recognize the right answer right away, we start to panic. So instead of panicking, try to eliminate answer choices that you know are wrong. Now, how do we eliminate answer choices? Here are a couple tips for you. We need to recognize that one word can make an entire answer choice wrong. So we want to make sure that we're reading the answer choices very closely. I've seen students misread an answer choice and fall for this answer trap. In fact, we were doing a multiple choice practice in one of my classes a week ago, and luckily my students didn't fall for it because they knew this trick, but literally one of the answer choices had like 10 words, and there was one single word of the 10 that made the entire answer choice wrong. And if students were rushing, I bet you they would have picked that answer because it looked mostly right. So a partially correct answer is not the right answer. That's another answer trap. It's also important to recognize that another answer trap is something called right answer, wrong question. And what this means is that the answer choice might be true of the passage. It's just not actually answering the question being asked. So for example, let's say that the question that they're asking is about paragraph 1. And one of the answer choices is true, but it's not actually talking about paragraph 1. Let's say it's true, but it's in paragraph 4. Well, yes, it's true, but it's not actually answering the question being asked. So we want to be a little bit suspicious of that answer choice and give other answer choices consideration. But it can be tempting to choose that one because it is true. It's just not actually answering the question being asked. I find that if students are more aware of the answer traps, they're less likely to fall for them. And in my experience as a teacher, these answer traps apply to the SAT and the ACT as well. If you are pressed for time, especially with the reading questions, prioritize questions that can be answered more quickly. For instance, those asking about a word in context or perhaps a specific line or paragraph. For questions with specific line numbers, make sure you read the surrounding lines too, because oftentimes there is a context clue, but it might not be in the lines they're talking about. On the digital exam, they're going to highlight the lines that they're talking about. And so this can be really helpful for students. So I'm sure there are exceptions, but in general, I would recommend reading the whole paragraph, even if it's asking you about a couple specific lines. Usually the paragraphs aren't that long anyway, and you want that context. One MCQ tip that I wish I knew in high school would be that you can read the questions first. Now, I'm talking about just the question stems, not the answer choices. This can help you read with a purpose. This tip might apply a little bit more for the paper version of the test as opposed to the digital test. And it's definitely a skill that I think you should practice beforehand. I would say about half my students read the questions first and the other half read the passage first. As a teacher, I have them try both ways multiple times before they figure out their test taking strategy. And so what my students will do for the paper test is they will read the questions and they will look for the key words in the question. So they'll annotate the question. They might underline or circle. There's usually a key word in the question. So let's say the question talks about lines 52 to 55. They will go to the passage and bracket off those lines and put the number of the question next to it so that they know that they need to be reading in that vicinity. Other keywords that they might look for are words like except. Usually that's in all caps, but sometimes students miss it. So they might underline that or circle that. While I know that annotating the questions like that doesn't work for everybody, I don't think it actually slows them down in any way. And for some of my students, it helps them stay more focused. Now, let's say you're taking the digital test or you're looking for more MCQ annotation tips. You want to look for shifts. So if you see the word yet, that's a pretty good indicator that there's a shift and there's probably a question about it. If the passage is really dense or really hard to understand, ask yourself, what is the passage about? Start there. Now, for these multiple choice questions, regardless of your test taking strategy, please go back to the passage. Don't just try to answer from memory, because since there are 5 answer choices and there's usually at least one answer choice that is purposefully very close to the right one, but isn't actually the right one, you want to make sure that you're going back to the passage. There are multiple questions that are explicitly stated in the passage if you just go back and find the answer. So even though it might seem like a little bit more effort to go back to the passage, it's not wasting your time if you're getting the correct answer. Remember, we want to be earning those points. Now let's switch gears a little bit and talk about FRQ tips. First of all, please, please, please attempt all essays. You can earn points for a thesis and at least one body paragraph with evidence and commentary. Like, we're talking, we can get at least a 3 out of 6 with a thesis and one body paragraph. So please just attempt all essays. You also want to consider writing the essays in the best order for you. Most of my students tend to start with the synthesis essay, not because it's the first one in the packet, but because it's the most time consuming. They like to get that one out of the way. But then for the second essay, it really depends. If they're stronger in argument, they'll probably do that one second. If they're stronger in rhetorical, they'll do that one second. I tell my students to put their weakest essay last. The reason why I suggest this is because sometimes students might get a little bit off pace and they might need a few more minutes with their stronger essays. That means they have a few less minutes with their weaker essay. But usually if you spend a little bit less time on your weaker essay, it usually doesn't hurt your score. Now, for some students, they might feel like they are equally strong at all 3. For those students, I tell them to look at the prompts on exam day and write them in the order that they think will be most successful. And that is why it is helpful to have a tentative plan. So if you know, for instance, that argument is by far your weakest, then you might want to put that last. Whereas if you know that you pretty much get a 4 out of 6 on all your essays, no matter what, on exam day, you might want to look at the prompts and figure out which one you think is going to be hardest and put that one last. It's important to have a game plan to know how much time you intend to spend reading, planning, and writing. I actually have a separate video about this on my channel, and I run a workshop for students on this, so I will link both of those in the description box below in case you want more information. It's going to sound really obvious, but you need to make sure that you are answering the prompt. I tell my students to annotate the prompt, so I want them to look for the phrasing. Like, for instance, in a synthesis essay, it might ask about the role, if any, of, and then whatever the topic is. I have them underline that. Sometimes I even have them turn that statement into a question. For rhetorical analysis, I want them to be looking for the words message, argument, or purpose, because it's going to have one of those 3. And so we really want to be sure that we're actually addressing what the prompt asks. So yes, every passage should have a purpose, but if the prompt is asking about message, we want to zero in on the message as we're annotating. And then the same thing applies to argument. I think of the prompt from a couple years ago where it was about the value of striving for perfection. I would want my students to underline the phrase value of striving for perfection. The key word there is not perfection. The key thought is striving for perfection, because those are technically 2 different things. So when you see your prompts, you want to slow down and make sure that you understand what you're being asked to write about. You also want to stick to the task. So it's really important that you know the difference between synthesis, rhetorical analysis, and argument. And of course, it's important for each of your essays to provide specific evidence and commentary. Make sure that your body paragraphs are proving your thesis. Now, this video is already getting a little bit long, so if you want individual tips for each of the FRQs, please check out the playlist on my channel. The last tip on this slide is to be thorough. I tell my students that I prefer to see more developed paragraphs. For that reason, most of my students only write 2 body paragraphs, but they still score very well on the exam. It is because they have plenty of commentary. Now, there are some questions that students commonly ask me on social media. As long as TikTok is around, I will be on that app answering questions. And some of the most common questions I get over there are, do I need a conclusion? The answer is no, it's not required. Now, if you're running out of time, please focus on your body paragraphs. Those are so much more important for your score. You need your evidence and commentary. However, if you have time to write a conclusion, do so, especially if you can zoom out and situate the issue in a broader context. So conclusions are encouraged, but not mandatory. Another question I receive over on TikTok quite often is, do I need to have a counterclaim and rebuttal? And the answer is no. For argument and synthesis, you are not required to address the counter argument. A lot of teachers might require this in their class because they're trying to make you a stronger writer and they're trying to reinforce these argumentative techniques. However, on the exam, it is not required. Now, it does say that one of the ways to earn the sophistication point for a synthesis or argument essay is to have a nuanced argument. And so some people assume that if they address the counter argument, it'll lead to a more sophisticated essay. It might help the quality of your essay, but it doesn't guarantee the sophistication point. So here's what I tell my students. I tell them to only address the counter argument if, number one, they have time to do so, and number two, they think it's actually going to help their argument. If it's not effective, they need to be spending their time writing the other body paragraphs instead. Also, if students are going to address the counter argument, it can technically go anywhere in the essay, but I've been noticing a trend where students are putting it as a third body paragraph. And in many cases, I think this is wise. The reason why is because you can omit that paragraph if you're running out of time, and you still have two other body paragraphs that are proving your thesis. Which brings me to my final point. 2 body paragraphs are fine. You are not required to write 3 body paragraphs. I tell my students I prefer quality over quantity. So some of my students will do 3, but many of them will do 2. So I think this is a choice that you as a student need to make based on your writing expertise and also the prompt at hand. If you found this video helpful, please do me a huge favor by giving it a thumbs up. Also, don't forget to check out the description box below. And as always, until next time, happy writing!